This is Tell Me What to Read, the podcast of Booktopia.com.au. I'm Nick Wasiliev, and today we have an incredible podcast special. Yesterday, the 2022 Stella Prize Shortlist was unveiled, and for those who are not familiar, the Stella Prize champions the work of Australian women writers, cis, trans, and non-binary inclusive. They strive to promote Australian women's writing, support greater participation in the world of books, and create a more equitable and vibrant national culture. Novels, short fiction, memoir, social history, book-length essays, and graphic novels are all eligible, but 2022 is an especially special year because this year eligibility was expanded to include, for the first time ever, poetry collections. Following the long list announcement on February 28th, we are delighted to announce the shortlist here, and I had the pleasure of sitting down with 5 of the 6 shortlisters to discuss their works. Here is the 2022 Stella Prize shortlist in no particular order. Take Care by Eunice Andrada from Giramondo Publishing. Dropbear by Evelyn Araluen from University of Queensland Press. No Document by Anwen Crawford from Giramondo Publishing. Bodies of Light by Jennifer Down from Text Publishing. Stone Fruit by Lee Lai from Fantagraphics. And Homecoming by Elfie Shiosaki from Magabala Books. Unfortunately, we were unable to have Elfie Shiosaki as part of this podcast, so before we begin our interviews with each of the shortlisters, I'd like to highlight her incredible poetry collection, Homecoming, as part of the shortlist. Homecoming pieces together fragments of stories about 4 generations of Noongar women and explores how they navigated the changing landscapes of colonialisation, protectionism, and assimilation to hold their families together. This seminal collection of poetry, prose, and historical colonial archives tells First Nations truths about unending love for children, those that were present, those taken, those hidden, and those that ultimately stood in the light. Homecoming speaks to the intergenerational dialogue around country, kin, and culture. This elegant and extraordinary form of restorative storywork amplifies Aboriginal women's voices and enables 4 generations of women to speak for themselves. This sublime debut highlights the tenacity of family as well as First Nations agency to resist, survive, and renew. The Stella judges have said of Homecoming that, quote, "Homecoming is both a genre-defying book and a deeply respectful ode to the persistence of Noongar people in the face of colonialisation and its afterlives. Elfie Shiosaki writes with a steady and often invisible hand, amplifying the voices of people whose words have been buried for too long. Shiosaki has produced a work of careful excavation. With an extraordinarily light touch on the page, Shiosaki moves beyond authorship, occupying instead the liminal space of daughter, caretaker, and choir master to a chorus of voices. Shiosaki has delivered a work of poetic and narrative genius and can be read either as an ensemble of poems or as a single piece that moves seamlessly between the elegiac and the joyful. Homecoming is a gift to the nation, one that works its magic with quiet grace and an unstinting clarity," unquote. We'd like to congratulate Elfie for her incredible achievement of making the 2022 Stella Prize shortlist with this collection of poetry, Homecoming. So, without further ado, let's dive into our first interview where I chatted with Evelyn Araluen on Dropbear. Hi, I'm Nick Wasiliev and I'm delighted to be with you today. And it's especially exciting because I'm being joined by Evelyn Araluen. She is a descendant of the Bundjalung Nation, is a poet, researcher, and co-editor of Overland Literary Journal. She has published criticism, fiction, and poetry and has been awarded the Nakata Brophy Prize for Young Indigenous Writers, the Judith Wright Poetry Prize, and more. And we're here today to talk about her collection, Dropbear, which is included in the shortlist for the Stella Prize this year. Evelyn, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's great to have you. And first of all, again, congratulations. It is so wonderful to see poetry recognized this year. And I feel like I should just start by smothering you with praise from the Stella Prize's description of Dropbear, first and foremost. Just to quote from them, Dropbear is a breathtaking collection of poetry and short prose which arrests key icons of mainstream Australian culture and turns them inside out with malice aforethought. Araluen's brilliance sizzles when she goes on the attack against the kitsch and the cuddly, against Australia's fantasy of its own racial and environmental innocence. Unquote. Whoa, what a start.
Yeah, it's really, they really gassed me up with that one. Still pinching myself a little bit.
How does it feel to be included in the Stella?
Oh, it's amazing. I aspired to be on a Stella shortlist like years ago when I first started writing, but I really did think I would have to bring myself to write a novel to eventually get there. So I didn't know when Dropbear was published that the Stella was going to be extended to include poetry as well. It is just it's an insanely ridiculous acceleration of some of my wildest literary dreams.
Well, it's wonderful that it is being recognised, and it's fantastic that of all the things that you've been able to get shortlisted for, this fantastic collection is the case. Before we dive into Dropbear, I just want to ask you in general about the recognition of poetry, because on a personal level, I feel like in today's world, poetry hasn't really been given the chance to shine as much as I think it should. Frankly,
yeah, it's harder to sell poetry. It's harder to market. It has, generally speaking, a smaller audience in Australian literature as well as globally, and that's something that we're seeing some significant changes in. The rise of Instagram poetry and the slam poetry. But there is an important place for single authored collections, those really tight bodies of work, and I'm really excited to see how many more works like that are getting out there in Australian literature at the moment, and then to have them be recognized by prizes like the Stella is just astounding. I think it demonstrates some really good confidence in the strength of Australian poetry at the moment, that investment in the landscape. So I'm hoping that some other prizes also consider that expansion, or even if we can look at potentially starting some new prizes for Australian poetry. Hopefully it's the start of some really good new things that encourage people to read poetry if they hadn't already got stuck into some of it.
Yeah, and the art form as well. Just the chance to actually highlight that poetry is a very important part of just literacy in general. It's incredibly valuable, and to see it recognised with larger prizes, I think it is something that definitely needs to happen. But turning to Dropbear, especially Indigenous poetry, I think it's some of the most compelling forms of writing Australia has produced in general. Particularly around how many Indigenous poets of the past have often gone out of the way to really deconstruct the clear issues and paradoxes that exist within the culture of the Australian nation that we have at the moment. I mean, your Jack Davises, your Lionel Fogartys, and of course, Oodgeroo. With Dropbear, I sense you really wanted to this is my own analysis, of course, looking at it, but you wanted to really hold a mirror up to the Australia of today with this work.
Yeah, I am interested in Australian nationalism and the problems that it creates, but also the myths that it sustains. And, you might describe Dropbear as being relatively minimal stakes, like talking about kitsch, talking about children's literature, talking about popular culture. But the reality is that these sorts of images, myths, archetypes, they're very persuasive, and they continue to be recontextualized and recommercialized in Australia. And I wanted to speak to that. I wanted to speak to how I was raised up, acculturated into these ideas as well, into these images, and the criticism that I think should be at the heart of how we view some of these things. It's not that I'm trying to cancel Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie. It's more so that I think that we need to have an open and honest conversation about how the cute, the seemingly innocuous, the kitschy can actually be an extension of some broader and more vicious settler colonial ideals.
Mm, mm. I got a real strange sense of feeling as I got the chance to check out sections of this, and the word that kind of was sitting with me because it was complacent. I think there was a great patch of poetry that you highlighted, and I just want to read it. Australia is a man's country, and you're here to die lovely against the rock, to fold like linenly into horizon and sweat beautiful blonde on the beach. And there was the feeling of that kind of complacent feeling that I got from this that you were trying to address, that I worry in Australia we are getting complacent, not just with the cultural issues we need to address, not just between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, for example, but with everything. With especially, for example, treatment of country, climate change, the entire space around that, the politics, everything. And you occasionally provide imagery and feelings in this book that almost feel apocalyptic. I feel like that's quite strong, but yeah.
I am interested in how we think about and how we kind of visualize the idea of apocalypse and dystopia, when so much of Australian culture is about aestheticizing the landscape as this beautiful down under outback kind of thing. And, you know, particularly if you look at like some of those old films that were largely funded by Tourism Australia, they're about selling an idea of Australia. And it's one that either we bought or, as you say, we've become complacent with it. But it's an unsustainable, environmentally and politically, an unsustainable vision of Australia. And you know, I don't like being sold my own country in these inverted, bizarre images that are usually about celebrating white culture and all of its toxic, commercial, white masculinity, bizarre, kitschy ways. So, yeah, I think complacency is a thing that I rile against particularly. Like, if you're wrong about something, you can be wrong about it. But if you're just not educated on it enough to care, or if you're refusing to engage with an issue and with, you know, with underlying political, social, cultural concerns, I'm quite finding myself quite frustrated with that. Very clever people who should know better support and idealize tropes and images and stereotypes that are really, they're not healthy for people and they're not healthy for country.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you've definitely achieved that in this collection, because while it did occasionally feel almost like apocalyptic in terms of it, I dare not turn away from the page, because it was filled with responsibility and a desire to want to make things right. And additionally, what I really liked about this, unlike a lot of works which just look purely at, here is the problem, we need to do something about this, you make a optimistic prediction, I sense, near the end, of kind of redemption and hope for a decolonial future. Obviously, I don't want to get into spoilers of the poetry because I encourage our listeners, you go check it out yourself. But I'm curious, because there is obviously so much work still to be done for us to achieve the goals of a reconciled Australia. What brought you to this conclusion as you were writing it?
Well, it's interesting. Your reading of that's interesting. And I think I wanted to leave certain possibilities of the way that it ends ambiguous. And some of them are ambiguous just because the collection ends with, I see there being really two poems that end it. One is the official ending, which is a very esoteric, technical prose poem about different kind of characters of Australian culture, and no spoilers, so I won't sort of refer to how that one goes. But there is also another poem. The one that just precedes that is one about coming home to see family and to just spend a normal, ordinary night with my family. And that one was written after 8 months of being away from my family, away from my community because of lockdowns in Melbourne. So I think hope is a radical act. fact. Like I believe that hope and preserving hope against all odds is not naive. I think it is work that reminds us to be human and to acknowledge ourselves as human, because the temptation becomes to kind of extend country the agency to just erase us if it needs to. And that's something that I've heard it described with the term misanthropocene, which is a kind of an endorsement of the power and potential for humans to essentially be the sacrifice to the Earth's continuity. But the reality is that no, the land does actually need humans participating in it. Certainly Aboriginal country needs that. We have our roles and responsibilities. So I think the collection kind of ends in a place of really trying to balance out that easy temptation to just endorse the idea that, well, whatever else happens, at least country will survive. Even if humans don't, at least country will survive, with an actual necessity to remind ourselves that we are human and that as humans we have a responsibility here, and that we can't simply just accept the idea that we can just fade into darkness with no more responsibility, no more accountability from that. So, you know, the whole collection is attempting to think about these problems not from a point of moral righteousness, rather to kind of think about how we're all entangled in these ethics. You know, there is no ethically pure situation. You know, I acknowledge as well in the collection, like, hey, I love Snugglepot and Cuddlepie. I love all of these terrible tropey films and books. Like it's you know, it's addictive for a reason. They are alluring aesthetics for a reason. I'm not above that or beyond that in any capacity. And similarly, I don't think I have solutions. I don't think the book pretends to propose solutions for a lot of the political, social, and environmental crises that it does reference. But, you know, rather just to sort of emphasize that however we imagine it, there does have to be a place for the radical possibility of survival and what that would entail in terms of our responsibility in an ongoing way to country.
Is that the kind of key learning that you took from having written all of this? Because I always like to finish our podcast by kind of asking the authors or the poet or whoever what the actual, I always find that the process of creating a book actually often teaches you more than anything else. So you go through experiences of writing and crafting this work, and you end up learning something about yourself or something about the world that you didn't before. Was that the end point that you just kind of arrived at, or did you get other learnings from having taken the time to sit down and create this work?
I think that's a really good question for a start. I will say that, and that's something that I haven't necessarily thought about in my own process. What did I learn from writing that book? But I think, I think I learned quite a lot. But yeah, I guess that that emphasis of hope as it's harder to hope. It's not the easy, naive thing to do. And when you're writing about these seemingly minimal stakes, but ones that are essentially microcosms of much broader issues of settler coloniality, it's easy to kind of get fatalistic. It's harder to actually do the work to think about how we might address these problems, how we might think about them in our everyday life, but also think about them in a kind of a historic way, in the sense of nationhood, in the sense of identity and what that symbolizes for our relationship to country. So I learned that, and I also probably did learn at one stage that I really don't know how to spell, and I'm just very glad that I had an editor. Worked that one out, luckily, before the manuscript was printed. So yeah, two lessons of equal value and importance.
I appreciate that. The more you learn to write and spell and things, the more you realize, God, I really need to improve my spelling and grammar.
Yeah.
Evelyn, I could honestly chat to you all day, but unfortunately we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come and chat to us about Dropbear. It's been a pleasure, and congratulations again on making the shortlist. You should be really proud of this collection, and I hope that it hopefully draws a lot more people to actually go and check out this collection for themselves and see what you have to say within it.
Thank you. Very lovely to chat.
Dropbear is published by University of Queensland Press, and you can get your copy right now from booktopia.com.au. Now over to our second interview with Lee Lai, author and illustrator of Stone Fruit. Hello, I'm Nick Vasiliev, and I am delighted to be talking with you all today. And it's especially just exciting because I'm joined by Lee Lai. She is an Australian cartoonist living in Montreal, and she's been featured in The New Yorker, McSweeney's, The New York Times. But we're here today because she is the author and illustrator of the beautiful graphic novel Stone Fruit, which has been included in the shortlist for this year's Stella Prize. Lee, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
It's lovely to have you here. And first of all, just congratulations. Just to see you, flying the flag for graphic novels on a personal level, I'm just like, yes. But also kind of seeing you recognized with this shortlist is just such a wonderful achievement. And kind of before I pick your brains about this wonderful book that you've put together, I feel like I should just give you a victory lap. And just let the Stella judges' comments just speak for themselves for a moment. They kind of described this as, quote, a deceptively simple depiction of the many various and complicated versions of familial love and care we can experience in our lives. Stone Fruit is a work that is honest, unassuming, and powerfully told, unquote. This book has left an impression on a lot of people. I've seen it it was an honour book at the ALA Stonewall Award. It was a finalist at the Lambda Literary Award for LGBTQ comics. How does it feel to actually now be included in the Stella?
It's wild. It's like, I feel like I've got to be a bit of an ass for a second, but I'm new to publishing, and this is my first book that I've published. I've been doing short comics and kind of independent comic stuff for the last decade. But I don't know a lot about the publishing world or the literary world. And so it feels really special to be recognized by a literary award that's not comics focused, as much as it's been really great to get comics recognition for this book. And also, I'm in Montreal now. I've been in North America for the past nearly 6 years, which is wild. And so most of the things that have been happening surrounding the book, because my publisher is American also, have been in North America. And, I grew up in Australia, and I don't know whether it was intentional, but I feel like a lot of Australian media was really pushing Australian media and kind of monitoring how much American media was coming in. I feel like I grew up with mostly British media. And so I didn't know a lot of the North American book awards and conferences and things that I ostensibly should be excited about. And so when my book started kind of getting included in lineups and noted by certain institutions and whatever, my publisher would be calling me being really excited, and I couldn't quite figure out how to be excited because I didn't have kind of context for it. But the Stella I do know about. And so I've kind of been more excited about that than anything else, because I have all this context for it, and I've admired authors that have been on the Stella, and it's also, in my hometown. So it just feels really, really exciting.
Yeah, it's fantastic to see you included on this list. And additionally, I'm not surprised that it's kind of it's bowled you over a little bit, especially just in the writing process. Kind of for many readers, you see a book on an award and being nominated for an award, but as writers, when you're writing this book, you don't often think about awards. You're just writing for you at the end of the day. You've just got this story that's in your head, and you're crafting it for you at the end of the day. And but it is wonderful to just see that this story that you've been working on for a long time, just getting the recognition that it deserves. It's a really beautiful book. So for listeners who aren't familiar with Stone Fruit, what is it about?
Oh God. When I published this book, before I published this book, I was trying to explain what it was about to people, and I was just going on these really long tangents and getting really confused. And then it wasn't until I gave it to someone who markets books for a living to get a copy edit, and I was like, oh, that is what it's about. But so I feel like at this point I'm kind of copying what my publicist wrote about the book. and what reviewers have wrote, but it's about the relationships between two queer aunties who are in a relationship with each other, and the kind of the breakdown of their relationship. And then from there, the book kind of splits out and explores the relationships that they have with each of their families, who they have complicated ties to and like have kind of pushed away and then are trying to reunite with in different ways. And the kind of spark plug that pulls them all together is this 6-year-old niece called Nessie, who has particularly fun ways of doing play, and also is quite watchful and quite sensitive to the adults and the anguish that they're experiencing. And it's set over a series of months of their relationships kind of coming to a bit of a catalyst, and swirls around a winter where everyone's having a bit of a bad time.
Yeah, you killed me. Wow, with this book, you killed me. Like, there's no sort of stereotyping. There's no sort of pandering. This just shows these relationships as they are. I've been lucky to have some of my closest friends are trans or transitioning, and some of the things that they've talked about with me on a personal level is stuff that is all peppered all through this book. Bron with her sister, who her religious sister, who just really struggles to come to terms and grasp with the entire notion of identity that trans people, first of all, have to go through themselves, which is an incredibly difficult experience, but then come to terms with in their own personal way. As well as Ray with her sister, her single mother who works like crazy and is very angry and resentful and a very tough character. Like she's gone through a lot herself. It's like there's a lot of intricate detail here that when I was looking at this book, I just thought, this has just happened. The stuff that you're speaking about and you're talking about here, I just see happen. Like it's everywhere. It's just how it is, which is something I think is so beautiful that you've captured these moments here in this book.
I mean, thanks. That's so cool to hear. The funny thing is that most of it didn't actually happen. Like, it is very much fiction, and I think the fact that it's fiction and it's kind of made up is important to me, because I don't think, I've met a lot of artists, especially in the comics world, who really do memoir so well, and they write really, really intensely from their own experiences, and I think that is incredible, but is so unrelatable. I don't know if I could write anything vulnerable if I was writing about my own experiences, because I think I'd be really, really cagey, and I think I'd be doing a lot to be somewhat dismissive of the emotions in the experience, and I think fiction allows me to make the emotional lives of the characters more candid.
You're not putting them in a box.
Ideally, yeah.
Yeah, you're not putting them in a box. You have the play space to really kind of take them in any direction, which is great. You do show love in all its forms here as well. I wanted to talk about Bron and Ray, kind of the central kind of couple in this story, because they really love and relish their role as kind of the fun aunties to Nessie, who you talked about at the top when we were describing this book. And I also kind of got that sense of when you're a child, you always remember life so fondly, but then when you're an adult, you always have to put fronts up, particularly when you're around children. And of course, you see that happen, and then that front is brought down for the reader when we see the strains that this relationship is under, especially Bron's depression that she's dealing with. It is. The feeling I got after finishing it was that it's bleak, but there is beauty in the bleakness. There's love, there's a dance with depression, there's a lot here. Why, kind of on that topic of having using fiction as that space, why are relationships, and particularly relationships like this, so just compelling to write for you?
I ask myself this all the time. I love consuming stories about difficult relationships. I'm always compelled when friends talk to me about like their family relationships or their romantic relationships, their friendships with me, like in all of their glory and all of their difficulties. It's fascinating. I don't know, like it's something that's been interesting to me since I was a kid. My skills and language and frameworks for thinking about relationships are constantly changing as I meet more people who are growing and able to articulate their experiences more, as I'm experiencing that with myself. But I think it's always been something that my life orients around, and that therefore I think anything I'm going to make just gravitates towards as well. And it was important to me to write relationships that had no archetypes in them. Everyone's messy, everyone's doing the best they can. I wanted to write a breakup where no one's the asshole, but everyone's making mistakes, and everybody's trying as hard as they can, because I think most of my experiences with difficulties in relationships is that, you know, the closer I get up to someone, the less of a villain they are, and the more they're just complicated and messy. I guess it's like the fun part is realizing that other people are interested in that too. It definitely leads to great conversations in my life, and it leads to really interesting dialogue between like anyone who's willing to consume my work and me, if they want to talk about it with me.
It's great that you did talk about this, because I feel like if particularly, you know, there's always a front in this day and age, especially because of I think partially I think based around our new hyper obsession with social media, that again, similar to the front that Bron and Ray put up with Nessie, we put up a front for everyone else that everything is fine, but relationships are never fine. Like, and I think we should embrace that. We should embrace. If we had figured out relationships, we wouldn't be having, you know, conversations like this. And the truth is, we'll never, as a species, we'll never figure out relationships. And it is always great to just talk about it together and explore it together and see what we do right and what we do wrong. And there is no right way to do anything. And I think it's wonderful that you're tackling this head on with this book, because it's just like, oh, thank you, finally. Oh, thank you. Yes,
that's nice.
it's warts and all, and I love it. And it also plays into the illustrations, because I mean, this is a graphic novel, and I really want to, you know, talk to you a little bit about them if I can, because first of all, I love graphic novels. I mean, I grew up reading, you know, V for Vendetta and all of those are really wonderful like books, and I think it's a really underappreciated art form. You know, there are so many wonderful graphic novels out there, and the illustrations here are kind of it's similar to the line of like bleak but beautiful. There's a real beauty and melancholy to them. I was kind of looking up reviews before, you know, chatting to you about this, and Rachel Cook from The Guardian kind of had a very funny way of describing it as kind of having a minimalist indie film tone, which I thought was like interesting. Like it captures it, but also like, yeah, I kind of see that a bit. What was the feeling that you wanted to go for with your illustrations? And additionally, I feel like I should also kind of, it's a good opportunity now to kind of, can you explain how difficult it is on top of that for graphic novelists to kind of strike that balance between words and illustrations as a combined storytelling tool?
Yeah, it's fucking hard. Like obviously every cartoonist has their own way of doing it, and that's what makes comics so exciting. And I think I'm in a good world of being surrounded by cartoonists who are just absolutely frothing their mouth to talk shop and to discuss ideas, and everyone's really, really excited about their craft. Like for an industry where people don't make much money at all, if any, and it's like not a real job, everyone just cares so much about it and has so much to say about the form. And I think like any creative form, it's exciting in its limitations. So the fact that you're confined to panels, if you will, to pages, like there's lots of things that are difficult about like combining text and visuals at the same time. It's like complicated to read sometimes. It's kind of, you have to have some idea of semiotics and visual communication to make sure that you can be understood. But there is so many ways in which things can be communicated only through graphic novels and cartooning in general, that I think is really, really exciting. I think there's something about the pacing of sequential imagery. There's something about being able to draw dialogue, to like make dialogue part of your visual compositions, that is just so exciting, and can be like a really fun experience as for a reader as well, which I would hope is the case. I think I tried to make this book very easy to read as far as graphic novels go. I think I've read some really difficult graphic novels in terms of the density of the images or like the complexity of the layouts. Most of this book is a 4-grid. There's not a lot of dialogue in each frame. Like I think I tried to space it out relatively sparsely, so it's not like a heavy on the eyes kind of read. And that felt important because it is kind of a bummer of a story. And so I want it to be able to be a fluid read, so we can kind of like pull each other through the harder parts of the book, you know?
Mm. Well, I'm glad you did it, because it works. It's simplicity, but you know, it's also kind of that less is more. You kind of work that simplicity into a strength, given what the story's about and who the story's about and how given the themes and the nature of the story. It's just having excessive artistic sake for artistic sake can sometimes be a bit of a detraction. And just keeping it simple and to the point, but letting the actual artwork and the story tell it together, I think really added hugely to it. I don't want to kind of repeat your standard boring question of what you want your audience to get out of it, because I think any answer to that question is we'll read the book and find out, damn you. So instead, I kind of want to ask at the end of this chat, what did the book teach you?
Well, I think I wrote it. It taught me a lot about the technical trials and learning curves of doing a long form fiction piece. And it taught me that even as in life, like people can surprise you, even if they're made up. I was surprised a lot by the characters as I wrote them, like how much more there was to them than I thought there was, and how I can't put people in boxes. Like initially, Amanda was supposed to be just more of an antagonist, and she still is in many ways, but she's also got a lot of lovable qualities and reasons to feel, you know, gently towards her. But I also wrote this book on the tail end of kind of learning my own specific lessons about how relationships are out of our control to some extent, and people are complicated. And we can be doing our best and things still can fall apart. And so I think this kind of this book was the kind of manifestation of that, so to speak. Like it was the closing of that, and also the opening of the next chapter of figuring out like, well, what's next? And I think the characters, the book kind of ends with the characters asking that question, as was in my life when I finished this book, and is still, and probably will be for the rest of my life. Yeah,
indeed. There's so much to take out of this book, and it's wonderful that it's just such a wonderful, nuanced examination of something that is in the everyday, which is great. And it's wonderful that the Stella Prize judges have recognized this book, and it's wonderful that you've made it to the shortlist. You've made it to the top 6, which I think is fantastic. Lee, I could talk to you all day. I really honestly could, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to come chat with us, and congratulations on making this shortlist. You should be really proud of this book. You really should.
Thank you so much. Thanks for reading it. Thanks for telling me what you think.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, and everyone should definitely go and check it out. Stone Fruit is published by Fantagraphics. And you can go check it out on the Stella Shortlist right now. And you can also get your copy from booktopia.com.au. Now over to our third interview with Stella Prize shortlister Eunice Andrada, author of Take Care. Hi, I'm Nick Wasiliev, and I'm delighted to be talking with you all today. And it's especially exciting because I'm joined by Eunice Andrada. She is a poet and educator. Her first poetry collection, Flood Damages, won the Anne Elder Award and was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Poetry and the Dame Mary Gilmore Award. But we're here today because she is the author of another compelling, unapologetic collection of poems, Take Care, which has been included in the shortlist for this year's Stella Prize. Eunice, welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, Nick, and hi, everyone.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come and chat to us. And first of all, congratulations on making the shortlist. It is so wonderful to see poetry included in the shortlist this year. And I feel like I want to start by actually mentioning the commendation from the Stella Prize itself. They said, and I just want to quote, Eunice Andrada's second poetry collection meditates on the ethics of care and the need to dismantle in order to recollect, to recover, and to create. Take Care is a collection that understands the ways in which there are ways we must kill so we can live to celebrate, unquote. I think this is a fantastic, it's very difficult to summarize this beautiful collection that you have put together, but I feel like this summary does a damn good job to touch the surface of it. First of all, how does it feel to even be included in the Stella?
Oh, it's so exciting. I'm the biggest cheerleader for poetry, so I am just so happy that poetry is being elevated in this way. So often poets and their poems are in their weird little corner in literary prizes. So it feels a little strange for people to care about poems all of a sudden. Whereas I've been shortlisted for poetry prizes before, specifically for poetry, and people are like, people around me at work, don't care, but this is different, I guess, just from the reaction of some of the people around me. So it's really special. I'm so happy to see people like Evelyn Araluen there as well, and Elfie, Shiosaki, and Lucy Dan. So in the company of great poets.
Yeah, you are. It's wonderful to see the poetry, the poets that are being recognized. And before we actually dive into this collection, I actually want to poke you a little bit more about this poetry representation, if I can, because I feel like poetry isn't talked about enough, just in general these days, as much as it should, which is why, again, first of all, I'm glad to see it being recognized this year in the Stella. Where do you think poetry sits in the 21st century in general? Because I feel like it needs to be talked about more.
Definitely. No, I'm a huge believer that poetry should be absolutely everywhere in our everyday conversations, in our kind of like cultural references we so often draw from like pop culture and TV and media, but in my own little world, I'm always drawing from like the poems that I read and the poems that me and my friends read. So those are the references that I gravitate to very quickly, but it should be everywhere and it should be celebrated. And it's great that prizes like the Stella are making those steps to elevate poetry and poets, but there's definitely such a long way to go in terms of giving us the kinds of platforms that we need to create our work, to celebrate our work, and to share our work.
Exactly. I feel like there's a real need right now poetry isn't given, I think it should be available to kind of push itself out there and be allowed to have the platform as an art form to be recognized a lot more. And it is wonderful that we are having, prizes like the Stella that are putting it out there, but hopefully we can start to see that a little bit more. And also people start to see the value that poetry brings. It's a huge, it does so much good. Mm-hmm. It's such a fantastic good, not just for the world of literacy, but just in general. So many fantastic poets have summarized things in ways that, people, it suddenly gives it the means for people to actually understand the world around them, which is invaluable.
I definitely feel like, we say that artists are cultural workers, but I really see and feel and experience that with poets in particular, the ways that the poets around me move and speak, the ways that we're, like Red Room Poetry, for example, which is this organization in New South Wales, has established Poetry Month, our very own Poetry Month in Australia and New Zealand. So like the poets are out here working, working really hard.
Yeah, it is, and producing fantastic work as well. And on that, let's talk about Take Care. This collection is direct, it is honest, it talks politics, it talks power, it talks rape culture. I love the description of that you had for it, talking it as being means to survive within systems not designed for tenderness. You analyze so much about the patriarchy, the ongoing problems with it. I really love hearing authors and poets' perspective about the place that sent them down this path to create their work. What brought you to this headspace where you were in when you were crafting this collection of poetry?
For me, what brought me there was just a lot of silence, the silence and the kind of stagnation of lockdown, but also this this feeling that, in that silence, I could no longer ignore healing from and processing and facing the things that I had kept away or hidden away for so long, the things that I hadn't come to terms with. For so long I was just living in survival mode and compartmentalizing the things that had happened that were beyond my control, things that were beyond my consent, and I was just powering through my days in this way that I wasn't completely living within my mind and living within my body. And I wanted to be able to confront what had happened to me, these various layers of harm and abuse in childhood and in adulthood. But to do that, I also had to take a step back and see, these things that have happened to me are not only things that happen to me, they're not interpersonal problems, they're structural problems. Like you say, they are connected to so many other acts of violence, and not just acts, but structures of violence, from patriarchy to colonialism to capitalism. And these structures all depend on each other. And these structures are collaborating with each other against us and against our capacity for tenderness and care. So I wanted to be able to take a step back and really situate where I was in this landscape of violence and see the kind of path that I could lead. Because, I was in a turning point where I didn't want to live the way that I had been living for so long. And I didn't want my trauma to hold me back anymore. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm trying to live my life in a more conscious way, rooted in community too, of course, and see things more clearly. And I think the poems have led me to this place where I'm trying to see, as much as possible, and see as clearly as I can, what I cannot stand and what we should not be able to stand anymore as a collective.
It's unflinching, this collection. And it was, and I mean, it's come out at a very interesting time, because in the last few years, not, just before the pandemic, increasingly, we've had, there feels like there is a massive shift happening with people just not being able to tolerate these systems. From my perspective working here, it reminded me of where we had Amy Remekas on our podcast recently talking about her book On Reckoning, talking about the things that happened to women in Canberra, in the Houses of Parliament in Canberra. And just, there were moments in this book, you talk about, for example, this book, you touch on, for example, the issues that Filipino women face in their space. And there were some particular words, particularly your poem, Vengeance Sequence, that just, my goodness, you nail that. I don't want to say it's rage and anger, but there's a lot more to it. It's frustration and it's tiredness with the status quo. I love the lines of Filipino women stop working, empires shut down in a tantrum, refusing to care for themselves. We do not go back to work. It's unflinching. It looks the reader in the eye and tells them, we need to break this system. We need to fix this. This collection is a reckoning, but it is also a warning, is it not?
yeah, take care is often said, or even the concept of care um, is often, we have this very simplistic narrative about care, but we don't question who does the care, upon whose backs and upon whose care labor does the world depend. And more often, if you look at the global system of care, you'll see how exploitative that is and how exploitative it is towards women of color, particularly. I always speak, you mentioned a lot of my poems. They talk about specifically Filipino women and the experiences of Filipino women, because I don't really want to be speaking over the cultural experiences of other community groups. So I try to keep it as specific as possible. But yeah, you see these global systems of care and how exploitative they are towards women of color and Filipino women, particularly because Filipino women contribute so much to the Philippines' GDP. There are millions of Filipino women workers all over the world in industries of care, in hospitals, in aged care homes, working in domestic care for the elderly and the sick all over the world. And it's all invisible labor for the most part. So I wanted to really, drive home that weight of care, how heavy it can be and how burdensome it can be. And also just, when we say take care, it is a warning. It is a warning to the people around us. When women say take care to each other, they don't mean take care of yourself. They mean like, make sure you get home at night safe and like text me when you get home. So it is so loaded, these words, take care. And I wanted to, through these different poems in the collection, look at care work and care labor through a different kind of angle.
Yeah. Is this where the title, like, because I want to actually ask you a little bit more about this title if I can, because the actual words themselves, how in terms of the process of creating this collection, did this title really just nail it and summarize the whole thing for you as the name, Take Care? Because they are powerful words and it's a great title. How did that kind of, as you were creating this collection, you were covering a lot of ground with this work that you were doing. How did it just kind of emerge naturally? Or was there a particular moment where you realized this is it? This is the crux of what your work is about?
I think it did emerge naturally. I think there's no other way I would describe that process of finding the title, because I was, my obsessions were finding each other all at the same time in the same plane, like these questions about care labor, particularly coming from a family of Filipino women, where so many of us are overseas in industries of care. Learning how to take care of myself in the midst of trying to heal from the trauma. Also, just thinking about what it means to care at this moment, in time, in this moment, as well as when I was writing it in that moment when we're trying to care for one another, we're trying to care for our communities, but all these systems are turned against us. And we say, take care to each other at the end of every email, especially around that time, when it was around March 2020 and everyone was, so focused on trying to take more care of themselves. But how do you do that? How do you do that when there are so many systems that collaborate against your care, your capacity to take care of yourself and the ones around you?
It summarizes this so well. And I want to kind of now talk about these systems that you go into in detail. You said in an interview with Liminal, I've been pronouncing that correctly, in 2020, that one of the urgent reasons that you write is, if I may quote it, quote, to reclaim the power from which people like me, women of color, survivors of violence, immigrants, etc., have been dispossessed. When I write from the body, I try to hold a mirror not to myself, but to the reader and the world too, unquote. For many readers, me personally, I found it very educational because I'm come from a background in a place where this capitalist system has been beneficial for where I have come from in terms of where I am. But for people not like me, this is something that really affects them hugely. And there is grounds for serious need for change here. So it felt very educational for me on a personal level. But for you, was it more than just that? Was it a case of you wanted to have people walk a mile in someone else's shoes? Or was it also that you needed to, again, highlight that there is a reckoning around this that needs to happen and needs to change?
For me, moving from poem to poem, the collection, especially the poems that were talking about what it was like for me as a young girl, being left behind in the Philippines by a mother who had to work overseas and send money back home, and like the communities that I met all over the world, the Filipino Filipino domestic carers, or Filipinos who worked in the healthcare industry overseas. I wanted to humanize us as much as possible and really drive home that, we are real people with real communities. And, for a lot of people on the outside, it may not seem like our labor matters, or that our labor is the only thing that matters about us, and not actually ourselves, our hopes, our desires, and our futures. But I wanted to humanize us as much as possible in these poems, and especially shine some light on the ways that we delight. Even though you say and a lot of people say that the poems are confronting and some of them quite dark, a lot of them also are joyous and have so many moments of delight. And I wanted to put all of those atmospheres and imagery and emotions together because, I as a poet and I as a human being, and I'm like a full person, and my communities are made up of full people with who are so much more than the labor that they provide. So yeah, I mean, it's not so much getting the reader to walk a mile in the shoes of myself or people in my community. It's just, I want to celebrate as well as shine light on some of, the burdens that I and we carry in my own community.
You certainly did. And I just wanted to say just thank you, because it came through. And it's wonderful that there are collections out there like this that talk about this. I know, I'm aware that we're a bit short on time. So as kind of a final question, I don't want to kind of ask the boring question of what you want the audience to get out of it, because obviously it's go read the book. But as a final question, I always am curious when chatting with authors and poets, what did the creation of this book actually teach you? What was something that you learned about creating this work that you now look back on differently or view in a new light?
That's a really interesting question, because so many different ways of answering are flooding to my mind. The writing process was really intense and difficult. So I think, and it was liberating, but there were also so many moments of unease that I had to power through. And I think, the writing process is just living, not all writing is physical writing, but writing is just being in the world. And it taught me a different way of living in my body and being present in my body. And because I write so often from the archive of the body, unearthing things from my personal history and my family and my community's history. I think, writing these poems and putting the collection together in this long, arduous process just brought me home to myself in a different way. And I feel like I really have emerged from the writing and collecting of those poems, a different writer. And just, I don't know, someone who takes a lot less bullshit compared to from before I started writing and thinking about the work and thinking about interconnected systems of violence and how we are all implicated in this. And it made me a patient writer, but like a lot less of a patient person.
It's been wonderful to chat to you about this collection. And I really hope readers take the time to check it out and pick apart what you have to say in this book, in this collection. Eunice, thank you for taking time out of your day to come and chat with us. And again, congratulations on making the shortlist. You should be really proud of this collection.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. Take Care is published by Giramondo Publishing, and you can get your copy right now from booktopia.com.au. Now over to our fourth interview with Jennifer Down, author of Bodies of Light. Hello, I'm Nick Wasiliev, and I'm delighted to be here talking with you today. And I'm joined today over the magic of Zoom, through the wonderful world of Zoom, by Jennifer Down. She is a writer and editor whose work has appeared in The Age, Saturday Paper, Australian Book Review, and Literary Hub. And she's the recipient of the Sydney Morning Herald Young Novelist of the Year, both in 2017 and 2018. Her debut novel, Our Magic Hour, was shortlisted for the 2014 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript. But we're here today to talk about her third novel, Bodies of Light, which has made the Stella shortlist this year. Jennifer, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you, and it's a pleasure to sit here and talk about this wonderful novel that you have put together. First of all, congratulations on making the Stella. And to shower you with a little bit of praise and allow you to blow your trumpet for a little bit, I would like to just read what the Stella judges said about your book, if I may, for a second. Quote, "This is an ambitious novel spanning decades and locales that sees Down demonstrate her imaginative range and take risks following the success of her previous two books. The result is a daring and compelling work, suffused with pathos and an impressive degree of empathetic vulnerability." Unquote. Whoa! Yes, please. That
Big words.
Big words. How does it actually feel to be included in the Stella shortlist?
Oh, it's a huge honour, especially, given this year is the first that the prize has been open to poetry as well as other forms. And the resulting both long and short list was so strong. It feels a huge honour and kind of privilege to be counted among the shortlistees.
It was a very fascinating shortlist when very fascinating long list when it originally came out, rather, and to see your book in there included was wonderful as well. But again, I think the Stella have really done a fantastic job highlighting not just fiction, but again, like you say, poetry, non-fiction, everything. They cover a lot of ground with this list. Let's talk about your book. Let's talk about Bodies of Light, and also let's talk about Maggie Sullivan, the narrator of this book, a kid who is, I guess, institutionalized and caught between foster homes and her father is a drug addict. Her mother OD'd in a toilet. She crafts new identities for herself. She moves countries and everything, and yet trauma and abandonment follow her. The ways in which, kind of similar in the ways in which that she had been failed over and over by all the institutions and individuals that she comes across. This is a this is a strong, this is a difficult read, but a necessary read. I just was wondering, how difficult was it to craft this character and craft this story?
I guess difficult in the sense that, it's, as you kind of alluded to, it's a quite heavy subject matter, but not difficult in the sense that it's the sort of story, I mean, specifically in regards to residential and out-of-home care in Australia, there's not a lot about that we see both either in fiction or in, any kind of media or art representation. It exists, but it's few and far between. And in fiction or in film, it tends to be a kind of, I guess, a narrow perspective, I would say, that can either sensationalize or romanticize the experience, or much of what we see is also kind of mediated through the American or Hollywood lens, which is not inherently problematic, but is also not necessarily representative of what it means to have survived that system in this particular nation state, right? So I guess it felt like an easy, not an easy choice, but a compelling choice in terms of narrative and subject matter, because it felt like a small place that I could just sort of shine a light.
What I love about it particularly is so many people, I think this is an uncomfortable subject for a lot of people, either people who have been in the system or people who know people who've been in the system, or even to the case of people who have failed people and people that they know who have ended up in the system. What I found particularly fascinating reading this book is when you're talking about heavy subject matter, I think so many people often will, it's a tough line to straddle, because some people may look at what you're trying to say and go outright reject it based on their own experiences and take the approach of sweep it just under them, or take the approach of let's just sweep it under the carpet and not worry about it. But what I love about it is that you don't pull your punches, but you go out, you do it, you really get the reader invested in this, and really it's not just a case of telling the reader, you are showing why this matters, which I think is really, it's an achievement. It's a difficult line to straddle, and I think with this book you do it wonderfully.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think to do, like one of the biggest kind of questions that I wrestled with the whole time I was writing this book was, how can I tell this story without veering into sensationalism or trauma porn, or kind of making it seem like the trauma is a kind of structural or narrative technique rather than a reflection of someone's lived experience. And of course it is a work of fiction, but it's very much steeped in historical references and fact and heavy research and witness and first person testimony from survivors. And so it felt important to me to kind of approach it in a forensic way, and to the whole idea of first person narrative, right? It felt important that it be a really close reading, so that it felt. I kind of wanted it to feel like a testimony, and a few people have said it reads like memoir, which certainly wasn't my intention, but over time I've come to really appreciate that and feel quite humbled by it, because I think that to me is the opposite of something that reads as voyeurism. I want the reader to kind of walk alongside this person and witness everything that happens to her in her life, not just the traumatic things, but the moments of joy and of calm and of stability as well. And to have that narrative function as a kind of witnessing rather than something that's kind of grotesque or I don't know, splashy.
Glorifying. You don't want it to be glorifying, you want it to be real.
No, nor do I want it to be sort of sanitized. And that, it is a really hard line to walk, but yeah, I mean, hopefully, I can't be the judge of whether I've got it right, but hopefully, I don't know, it landed somewhere near where I was hoping.
So talk me through this actual process of crafting this voice. So I'm imagining you did a lot of research. You would have listened to a lot of people. What was that process like, going down that rabbit hole and learning about the issues that Maggie goes through in this book?
I mean, it's awful. Is the short answer?
Yeah.
I think I said to a couple of people before, I maybe came into the writing process with perhaps a broader knowledge than the average person of what it means to exist what it means to exist as a kid in the care of the state. Not because I have that experience myself, but because many members of my family work in welfare adjacent roles, and I kind of grew up with hearing these stories as part of my day to day. And so I was always aware of some of these issues as being kind of a baseline reality for a lot of young people. And then it had always been, I don't want to say passion, that sounds too strong a word. It's not like I've been out there on the streets, fundraising or taking in foster children myself, but it was always an issue that felt very compelling to me and very distressing. And I think even from the time I was a teenager, I was kind of bemused by the way that not even just mainstream media, really, all media just refuses to kind of acknowledge what's going on. And I always kind of wondered, is that because child abuse is just the one thing that is too white hot and awful for us to bear as a society? But then, as I got older, I was like, no, we're so compelled by true crime narratives or by, Law and Order SVU type shows. And, it's not that we abhor violence as a society, right? So what is it about the mistreatment of vulnerable children that is so uncomfortable for us? And I think in part it's because, we don't like the idea that we are in part responsible for it as citizens. These are effectively our tax dollars going towards some of this stuff, if you want to take the kind of Murdoch media approach, I guess. And so maybe that's part of it. I still don't understand it. But I guess that's a long way of saying I came into the research process with, I would say, maybe a little bit more general knowledge than most people would have. And I was still, I wouldn't say shocked by anything I read, but there's something really tragic and numbing when you just start to read about the sheer volume of things that young people have endured, and not just endured, but then carried with them for the rest of their time, and how that shapes the rest of their lives and affects relationships with others, their ability to find meaningful work and to forge connections with partners and friends and children and grandchildren. It really spins out into these I don't know, there are just perennial consequences of things that happen when you're very young. And so I think certainly the research was challenging in the sense that, you think at some point you might become a bit inured to the horrors, and there's always something more awful than what you've read the day before. And then I personally wanted to I started wanting to tell people about it, and of course no one wants to, it's such an ugly thing to talk about. But I kind of got to the point a few years in where I was like, why does nobody know this? Why is no one talking about this? So it probably, I guess, made me not a very fun housemate or friend to be around for a while. I think my pub conversations were not the most uplifting. But I know, I'm being flip, but I do think it's important to talk about and to kind of bring this stuff into the public consciousness.
You certainly do with this book. It is a topic starter. It's a conversation starter with this book. And the one particular thing I really admired was the tackling of trauma in this book. Almost the cyclical nature of it throughout the book. I mean, I got a sense of the fact that you really wanted to tackle the fact that Maggie has been a product of the world in which she grew up. But as you mentioned, that the effects that happen in this particular period of many children's lives go on to affect them for the rest of their life. But I also got a sense you were also interested in trauma, the actual effects of trauma itself, and the effects it has. What's the one, in your opinion, misconception people have about trauma that you maybe either sought to address in this book or learnt yourself while writing it?
Woof. That's a big question, and I want to preface this by saying I'm not a psychologist. I have no claim to any expertise. I'm just a foolish person, like a monkey with a typewriter. I think I don't know. I definitely didn't seek to address this question in writing, but something that I've kind of become really interested in is the way that society conceives of the archetypal survivor as often needing to make something productive from their trauma, or to kind of present their trauma in a palatable way, or to use it, to harness it in some way so that, it provides some kind of moral lesson to other people, or is informative in some way. And this whole idea of resilience and so on and so forth. And as I said, I absolutely was not writing this with, kind of consciously, but I've said in a couple of other interviews that this is not a kind of redemptive story. It's very much a story of survivorship. And I don't know that even since the book's been published, the more I read and the more I learn, the more I think we really need to reject or subvert that idea that to be a kind of good or useful survivor, right, firstly, that's even a thing. If you're a survivor, you're a survivor. There's no right way to kind of approach the rest of your life. But also that traumatic experiences are only as useful as the person who is able to kind of mold them into something palatable and presentable. And if a survivor is able to do that, all power to them. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it can be enormously, I think it can provide other people with a great sense of comfort and help other people to feel like they're not alone. I think that's really important. But also, if for you surviving means getting up and making a cup of coffee and taking your dog for a walk and not talking about the things that you've experienced, then that's also totally fine. And I don't know, I really increasingly reject this model that we've kind of collectively developed of the ideal survivor, or the kind of the palatable or the presentable survivor, I guess.
I particularly love you discussing about the idea that survival takes many forms, and I think it's also important, and it kind of comes through in the book, that people see that sometimes people have gone through so much and they do the best they can, and sometimes the best they can be difficult sometimes, and the importance is that you understand that and sympathize where they're coming from, which I think is really dealt with or examined well in the book, especially through the narrator. I do want to ask one last question, kind of about. I want to ask you a little bit about Melbourne in this book, if you can. You're Victorian, and you really do put the reader in a place with this book, kind of your southeast Melbourne from the 1970s into the present. What were some of the difficulties of translating that time frame to the page? Because obviously it's a part of the world that people are very familiar with, and people have a lot of connections, connotations, and conceptions about what it was like during that time period.
Yeah, to be honest, that was one of the easier parts, and I guess I kind of made an unconscious choice in some ways too. So I knew that I wanted to have this narrative that spanned, several decades, and so starting in the 70s was almost more of a structural choice than anything else. I was kind of working back with this timeline, and I'm prodigiously bad with numbers and dates, so I had to take quite a mechanical approach to it. But I realized that it was probably going, it moved around a little bit, but it was always kind of the beginning of the narrative was always kind of early to mid 70s. And I was born in 1990, so I don't have much of a consciousness of anything before about 93. but I did grow up in a similar area. In fact, there's one of the suburbs where Maggie lives briefly is where I grew up and where my parents still live. And my mum, a lot of the early passages are set in and around Dandenong, which is sort of this daggy outer suburban suburb that was previously it was quasi-rural, right? So that was where my mum grew up in the 70s and where, she went to high school. And so that for that reason, I think probably subconsciously I decided to set it out there. It also did fit in terms of, the kind of the demographic and things like that. But it was great because I was able to, like, very early on in the writing process, I was able to kind of get in the car with her, and we drove around. And she, as I said, went to high school there, but also worked in Dandenong for many years. And she was able to kind of, I guess my perception of it, like, I learned to drive there, right? So I know the streets at this kind of granular level, but I was able to drive with her, and she could say, oh, well, this was where, this old pub used to be, it closed down. There was, this happened. Or when I was a welfare worker, we used to put kids in this house. Or, this was where the market was on Wednesdays, and it always smelled like cow shit. And of course, now it doesn't, because it's very much like, it's a very suburban area now. But in the 70s, it was much more rural. And so that was really instrumental early on. And that wasn't the only research. There was a lot more kind of painstaking forensic combing of old maps and things like that as well. And old photographs were really useful. But I guess that was kind of the starting point, was just driving around and seeing those streets that I kind of know quite intimately a lot of the time, but seeing them through the lens of somebody who was there, 40 years ago.
You definitely do nail the place, which was something that, it was intrinsic to the book, which I loved, and it almost felt like a character in itself, the world of Melbourne. I know that we're running short on time, so I'll kind of finish with a question that I've kind of put to all of the shortlistees who've made it, or shortlisters rather. I don't want to ask you the boring question of what do you want the audience to get out of this book, because of course the answer is, well, go read it and make up your own mind yourself. So I want to ask, what did the creation of this book actually teach you?
Wow. I think somebody, if I can steal somebody else's answer, like a reader, when they read it, they said that, because I kind of kept joking before it was published about how this book is really sad and it's like unremittingly bleak and blah, blah, blah. And I think for a lot of readers, it probably is. And I'd also, to be fair, lost all perspective of it. Like, I developed a very dark sense of humor. And when I was writing this book, I kind of lost all sense of what was sad or not sad, or okay or not okay. But a gentleman who read it made this really lovely comment that, of course, there are many sad moments, but he also felt a sense of hope, in the sense that it was a reminder of how it is possible to, through reinvention, whatever form that takes, to live so many different lives across, the course of your time here. And I thought that was really beautiful. I certainly didn't go into the writing process consciously trying to do that, but I think the more that I speak to people who've read the book, that part of it seems to really resonate with people. The idea that we have, and I don't mean this in the toxic positivity way of like, getting up and choosing to be the best you can be every day, but just in the sense of possibility and the potential for change and renewal after even, something really awful has happened. There's always potential for something new.
It's a really positive sentiment to come from, given the world, the nooks and crannies you had to dive into with this book. I love that was kind of the space where you ended up. Jennifer, it's been a pleasure chatting to you about this book, and once again, just congratulations for making the shortlist.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure chatting to you, and for all of our listeners, Bodies of Light is published by Text Publishing, and you can get your copy right now from booktopia.com.au. Now for our final interview, I sit down with Anwen Crawford, author of No Document. Hi, I'm Nick Wasiliev and I'm delighted to be talking with you today. And it's especially exciting because I'm joined by Anwen Crawford. She's a longtime zine maker and collaborative visual artist whose work has appeared in publications including The Monthly, The New Yorker, The White Review and Sydney Review of Books. In 2021, she also won the Walkley Pascal Prize for Arts Criticism, and she's the author of Live Through This and No Document, the latter of which has made it onto the shortlist for the Stella Prize this year. Anwen, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So for all of our listeners who might not be familiar with No Document, can you tell us a little bit about this work?
It's like my nightmare question, honestly. Yeah, I spent 3.5 years writing this book and 3.5 years dodging the question, actually closer to 4 years dodging the question of like what it's about, quote unquote, and I still don't really have a satisfactory answer to that question. Honestly, the only answer I have to what No Document is about is that it's about itself. It's a book that's about itself, because it's an elegy. I mean, at heart, the book is an elegy for a very close friend of mine who I met at art school when we were in our late teens, in the early 2000s, and we were artistic collaborators and also political comrades, and the kind of connection between art making and activism was very strong for both of us. And he died in 2010 when he was 30. And yeah, so this is at heart an elegy for him, but it's also about a whole bunch of other things as well. And the thing with elegies is that they're a kind of and I have a background in poetry as well, I should say, which I think is important to the book. An elegy is a kind of compensatory labor. You're trying to, just like a gravestone or a burial mound or a memorial quilt or a Facebook wall, all these things that we do after people die that are kind of about doing a kind of work that is meant to honor the dead through the effort and the attention and the kind of love that you put into this memorializing. But at the same time, this kind of compensatory labor can't make up for the absence. It can't take the measure of that absence in any proper way. So in a sense, No Document, and this is partly why it's called No Document, I think, is that the book is a kind of incomplete record of its own making. It's an attempt to write an elegy, but an elegy is always, I think, on some fundamental level, a failure, because you can't bring back the dead. And I think all elegists know this at heart. This is kind of the terrible paradox of writing an elegy, is that you're writing something that will never be read by the person it's intended for, and the absence at the heart of the work can't be resolved. So that's my sexy pitch as to what No Document is.
I'm sorry, I feel like I really threw you in the deep end with that, because like describing this book is already quite a difficult, complex thing.
Very difficult.
Nice to hit you with a quote unquote easy question to start us off, but with this particular book, it is very difficult. And you cover a lot of ground in this book, and it reminded me. I've just reread, and we were talking about this before we started recording. It reminded me of a book called Mortals, which came out a few years ago, and which similarly examined this kind of space of death and grief. But here you go into a lot of other spaces with it. You talk about history, and you talk about disappearing artworks. I feel like I'm really. We've only got a few minutes to talk about this book, and I feel like doing so is such a disservice to this book. But even disappearing places of your youth as well, like you talk about Sydney and how it is changing as a place, which I found really fascinating, because I personally grew up in the country and have really started to notice the places that I grew up in changing as well. And you also talk about the boundaries, like boundaries that we have within our society in general, whether it be, through the work, through whether it be social, cultural, artistic, physical, whatever it may be. What is it about this space of study that fascinates you so much? Because it can seem quite a general thing to tackle, but here you go into a lot of detail. What is it about this space that fascinates you so much?
I mean, I guess this is a long-term preoccupation of mine, both particularly as a visual artist, but also as an activist, like I said, and one of the strands that the book traces in particular is a kind of the contemporary history, I should say, because it has a long history, the contemporary history of government policy, bipartisan government policy in Australia to exclude refugees who arrive here by boat. And this wasn't an arbitrary choice on my part. It's because it's a strand of activism that I've been involved in various ways for a long time. And, I, as a young woman, I guess, when I started art school in 2001, which is where I met my friend who this book is for. But 2001 is obviously also the year not only of the kind of the beginning of the war on terror, but something that very closely coincided with that, which is the arrival of the Tampa, what's kind of known as the Tampa incident, which is this, during the 2001 federal election campaign when John Howard, was prime minister and ended up being successfully re-elected as prime minister. There was this very, I'm just going to say, racist campaign waged against asylum seekers arriving from boat who were mostly fleeing the Taliban that Australia and the United States and other countries had just bombed. So we were in this situation where refugees who were being displaced by military action of Western countries in Afghanistan were arriving here by boat and were then being taken to kind of offshore detention centers. So I was very involved, particularly at this point, with kind of activism around that, at kind of going to several detention centers, including ones that at the time were kind of on the mainland of Australia, like the Woomera Detention Centre, which was an infamous detention centre on Kakatha country in the middle of the South Australian desert. And, obviously the kind of like long-term hysteria around in quote unquote invasion by boat people, quote unquote, in Australia is a kind of replaying of a deep psychological awareness of the fact that the nation exists in the first place because it was invaded by boat people, so these two things are tied together. And for myself as a kind of white settler in Australia on stolen land, trying to think through these two things together, trying to think through both a kind of anti-racist organizing and resistance to policies of border control, while also being aware of the kind of systemic violence that I am a part of as a settler on stolen land. These two things can't be separated from each other. So this is another very long-winded and unsexy answer to a question, but this is kind of where my, I guess, preoccupation with borders springs from. And in the book, it's partly represented in visual ways. The book has a lot of, and this comes out of my background as a visual artist too, but there are a lot of kind of formal qualities in the book that, I guess, in a sense, reproduce the notion of the border. So there are a lot of like lines and strike throughs. There are a lot of boxes. There's a lot of space, like a lot of one sentence stanzas that are separated from each other by space. So this kind of notion of things being of lines, of divisions, of borders. And then, of course, because it's an elegy, there's also this fundamental border that you can't cross, which is the border between the living and the dead, so that is also another border that is at the heart of the work.
It was so fascinating just watching you examine this space, and also I dare say like very timely, considering that especially over the course of this year things have these ideas of borders and division have become even more profound given context around what's happening right now,
like in the Ukraine.
Yeah.
And I mean, of course, one of the things that has totally alarmed and appalled me, and I think a lot of other people too, in I guess witnessing the coverage of Russia's invasion of Ukraine is the way in which various politicians and media commentators have been very kind of quick to offer their sympathy to Ukrainian refugees, which is all well and good, but that sympathy is entirely absent when it comes to refugees from non-European countries. So, there's a very obvious and systemic racism at work in a lot of the media coverage of Ukraine, because, they seem to be like us, again, in air quotes. And, one of the fundamental questions that drives No Document is the question, and this is in a sense, I'm going to borrow here from the theorist Judith Butler, who's a very influential political theorist, but Judith Butler kind of poses this question in a number of their books about, when is life grievable? Who is grievable? Who is able to be mourned because their life is seen as having value in the first place? So that's one of the questions that drives the book, really. Is it's a work of mourning, but I think not only just for the friend for whom it's written, it's about trying to think through how we can mourn those, for instance, people who have drowned at sea trying to reach Australia, how we can mourn these people who have been placed into a space where, a kind of political and rhetorical space where they are seen to be without value, that their lives were without value, and therefore that their deaths also don't matter.
A good point. I saw someone wrote in an article examining your book, and they put an analogy on it, which was great, which is you ask not merely about who are we, but on the subject of this, the question of what is quote unquote we as a group. And I get the sense you did want to reimagine this, but and I know, given the political background, there are also, I don't want to, of course, do any sort of psychoanalysis or anything, because obviously we all experience.
I'm all in favor of psychoanalysis. There's far too little psychoanalysis in the contemporary world, as far as I'm concerned. We could do it a lot more.
But with these actual boundaries themselves, I got a sense that you really wanted to. I don't want to say break the boundaries down. Because is that even possible in terms of an examination of what quote unquote we are, but at least either bring an awareness to the fact that these boundaries are it's not just a case of what you see on television or whatever, or within the spaces of that are seen as for quote mourning in the strictest sense of the word. Is it just more of where does that? I get a sense that I feel like I'm now getting long-winded with my question as well. But can we actually bring these boundaries down? Or is it just something that is simply systemic within human nature and the concept of what we are?
No, I don't believe in a kind of ahistorical notion of human nature as some stable thing, and oh dear, what a shame, it's just inevitable that, we've ended up living in this world that's full of kind of social hierarchy and racial division and the kind of exploitation of planet Earth unto its ultimate death. That's not an inevitable part of human nature. I'm as someone of the kind of radical left, I'm very much a kind of historical materialist. I want to know the actual historic reasons for why things have happened, and why the world is as it is. And I would very much like to see those kind of social divisions demolished, dismantled. I guess, though, too, for me, there's a kind of, I have a certain caution around the notion of I very much believe in the kind of collective and in collective organizing and thinking in collective terms. At the same time, I'm very aware, again, as a kind of student of history, of the ways in which thinking in terms of the collective, in terms of a we, almost inevitably means an exclusion. If there is a we, then someone or something is outside of the we. So how do you then organize collectively to dismantle these kind of hierarchies without producing further exclusions? And again, how do I specifically, as a kind of settler on sovereign Indigenous land, how do I organize against the kind of violence of national borders while also not, furthering the work of kind of colonization? And these aren't questions that I can answer on my own. I mean, I think all these questions are present in the book, but the book is not an attempt to answer any of these questions, because I don't think I can answer them myself. I think they have to be answered, like I say, collectively and over time and through action, and through art too. Apart from anything else, the book is a kind of I guess a testament to what all kinds of artists and art making has meant to me, and the ways in which art can, in a sense, keep our imaginations free, can allow us to envisage versions of the world that have yet to exist.
And and I think that's one of the great wonders, the great wonderful things about art, and the way that it can reinterpret all of these things. But I also just love, the really interesting thing about what you said there, because it is a great point that you mentioned, that the book offers no concrete answers or solutions, because for a fact, you were dealing with topics that are so huge and considerable that it is to almost wrap it up in a bow, I think would be, there's no way you could capture all the different perspectives on it. But even then, I still find this examination so fascinating, because within itself, these are the spaces where these questions are being asked. The book itself becomes an examination to challenge to actually put these questions out there and challenge them, which I think is something that we need to do. It's important that it becomes that space itself.
Well, I hope it's a book that allows people to kind of think, but I never, as a writer or as an artist, want to tell people how to think or what to think, and I always feel frustrated by work, when I encounter work myself as a reader or as a viewer or whatever, that doesn't extend me the respect of allowing me to make up my own mind. Work that tries to kind of dictate a reading, I find really irritating. And so it was always in my mind that I wanted the book to be very open-ended in that way, and to be a book that each reader would really kind of put together and have a kind of, that each reader would have a different encounter with it, partly because that kind of notion was very important to my friend and I when we were young artists. A lot of our work was done, he came from a kind of graffiti art background, and a lot of our work was done on the street, kind of very informally and generally illegally. But part of why we were drawn to working on the street and kind of outside of formal gallery spaces is that we kind of had this notion that, if you were to just encounter something in your day-to-day life, like on a wall or on a reclaimed billboard or in an empty building or whatever, that that you could kind of come to it with your own understanding, and kind of figure out for yourself kind of why the work was there, what it was saying, what it was trying to do, as opposed to sometimes the kind of imbalance that can exist, when you go to a museum or a gallery and you kind of feel quite overawed and like, the whole thing is a bit sacred, and that you kind of you feel as if sometimes you can feel intimidated into feeling like you can't think about the work that you're looking at because you're not meant to, because you're standing in this big museum that's like a church, and so I never want readers to feel that I'm speaking down to them in any way. I want a kind of equal participation between us, even though I'm the one who's written the book. You as a reader can really kind of put it together how you choose. I hope.
Well, it definitely does that, because I think if the questions that are posed is something that the reader is encouraged to engage with and examine on their own terms. It is wonderful that people have responded to it the way it has, that they have, because you are touching on so many things here, and I also love when examining it, making the shortlist, that what the Stella judges had to actually say about this book. And I'm going to read a quote back to you and shower you with a little bit of praise for a moment, in terms of what they said about the book. And they said, quote, "This work is a complex, deeply thought and deeply felt ode to friendship and collaboration. There is a persistent feeling that through grief, remarkable and devastating, one is able to temporarily glimpse everything they need to know. The emotional, paradoxical tumble of grief and hope represents a universal desire for meaningful change, and no document implores us to harness that desire collectively." Unquote. And there is a longer quote that is on the Stella Prize, which I'll link to in the description. For you personally, I know we again talked about this before you jumped on, but how does it feel actually to be included in the Stella for this work?
I mean, it's an honor. It's a real honor to be included on the shortlist, because it's such a strong long list, and I think the long overdue inclusion of poetry on the Stella Prize has made a world of difference. And, for myself, I was always one of those people who could never understand why it was excluded in the first place. And, so I think the inclusion of poetry is, long overdue and really wonderful. And, I mean, I didn't know what was on the rest of the long list until the rest of the long list was announced, and I had read every poetry title on the long list when the long list was announced, and I was so pleased and honored to be among the company of those poets. Because my book draws so directly upon poetry, so to be included on the shortlist from among such a strong and interesting, and I think genuinely unconventional field of writers on the long list, that's a real honor,
and it's well deserved. I think it just goes to show how much wonderful poetry has come out in this particular time, and I think it's wonderful that this art form is getting noticed by prizes like the Stella.
For sure, it makes a difference, because poetry is so marginalized in commercial terms, and and I do very much believe that the real strength of writing that's being produced in Australia is coming from poetry. And so if more readers find poetry because of the Stella, then that's all for the best.
Yes, I hope so. Yeah, I do think particularly in this day and age, has been very much an underappreciated art form, and hopefully we can see that change. I'm aware that we are short on time, so I'll leave you with a final question.
Mm-hmm.
I always, for all our listeners, I don't always say to them, what do you hope listeners will get out of it? Because the answer I always would respond if I was in that position was, well, go read the book and find out for yourself.
Yeah.
So instead, I want to ask, because you were with this book for so long and you covered so much, what did No Document teach you?
What did it teach me?
Do you look upon the world in a different way now, for example?
No, not especially that, but I think it did teach me maybe that I'm more optimistic than I thought I was. I mean, for a book that's about a lot of very serious things, a number of people have said to me that they found it very hopeful. And I think that's true. I mean, I think by the time I got to the end of it, I was surprised for myself at how much kind of hope, maybe a testament of a natural optimist than I am. But then maybe I discovered that I'm an optimist too, insofar as, you know, in spite of everything, I don't think that history is ever foreclosed in its meanings. I don't think that the kind of events of history are ever inevitable. And, you know, when we think of them as inevitable or as human nature or whatever, we tend to allow ourselves a kind of passivity in the face of events that I don't think is very helpful, to put it mildly. So kind of, yeah, I think the book taught me that I still very much believe in the possibility of change on a kind of widespread and systemic level. I think I went through a long period of despair, not only after my friend's death, but, you know, in the wake of certain events that this book documents, like, for instance, the invasion of Iraq in 2003. You know, I think I had a long time of feeling that things were pretty hopeless, but this book, when I finished the book, I realized that it had a lot more hope in it than I had anticipated that it was going to. So that's probably a good thing.
I love that. You feel more optimistic. That's, I mean, considering the ground
on some days.
Covered. On some days. I think considering the ground that you've covered, I reckon that is an amazing learning to take from this. I could honestly chat to you all day, but I'm aware that we're very much out of time. I'm sorry, but Anwen Crawford, thank you. It's been a pleasure chatting to you about this book, and again, congratulations for making the Stella Shortlist.
Thank you. Thanks, Nick.
No Document is published by Giramondo Publishing, and you can get your copy right now from booktopia.com.au. Thanks to all of our guests, and congratulations to all for making the Stella Prize Shortlist for 2022. You can find links to all of the books discussed today in our show notes, or head over to booktopia.com.au. The winner of the Stella Prize will be announced on April 28th, and will be taking home $50,000 in prize money. We wish all shortlisted authors the best of luck. Join us next week as we return to our usual episode format, with next Wednesday seeing us sit down for an Australian non-fiction special, which will see us chatting with Indira Naidu and Peter Fitzsimons. Thanks for listening, and never stop reading.